cheating. It began, as many devastating realizations do, with a casual glance that changed everything. Marcus had been sorting through the attic, a dusty weekend chore he always postponed. In the far corner, behind boxes of Christmas decorations and old yearbooks, he stumbled across a small, unmarked envelope. It wasn't unusual to find odd things up here. He and Lydia had lived in the house for 15 years, but something about the envelope's placement seemed deliberate, almost secretive. He unfolded it and found a series of letters, neatly handwritten, and each one was signed with a name he didn't recognize. At first, he thought perhaps they were letters from a friend or a distant relative he hadn't met. But as he read, the truth began to unfurl like a slow, insidious smoke filling a room. The letters weren't friendly. They were intimate, full of confessions, longing, and a closeness that cut deeper than any sharp object ever could. Marcus sank to the floor, the letters trembling in his hands as the world around him went mute. He couldn't process it immediately. 15 years. 15 years of marriage, of shared mornings, birthdays, laughter, and whispered, "I love yous." And here was evidence that Lydia had been living a life parallel to the one he thought they shared. He felt like he had been asleep inside his own life. Every memory was suddenly suspicious. The business trips Lydia had taken, the late nights she claimed was spent with friends, the sudden volunteer projects that cropped up in her calendar. He replayed scenes in his mind, trying to reconcile the woman he knew with the woman who wrote those letters, whose handwriting he now recognized as hers. The more he looked, the more the inconsistencies revealed themselves. Sitting there among dust and forgotten holiday lights, Marcus felt something strange. A paralysis that rooted him to the floor. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, and yet the world outside the attic was silent, ordinary, oblivious. He wanted to call her, demand an explanation, but his throat constricted. The thought of confrontation, of seeing the truth in her eyes, was unbearable. Instead, he spent hours in that dusty silence, reading every letter, cataloguing every date, every lie, every hidden thread of intimacy that Lydia had woven outside their marriage. The memory of their wedding day flickered in his mind. Her in a flowing white gown, the way she laughed when he whispered something foolish in the church aisle, the kiss that sealed a promise he thought was unbreakable. And yet, for every joyful memory, there was now a shadow lurking behind it, a doubt that slithered in and tainted it. Had she been smiling at him while thinking of someone else? Did she hold his hand with honesty? Or was it another mask? Marcus tried to sleep that night, but sleep was a stranger. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic breathing of Lydia in the other room, the home they built together suddenly alien. He wanted to confront her, to demand the truth, but he couldn't summon the courage. Instead, he let the letters guide him, each one an arrow piercing his heart, each word a betrayal he had never imagined. The next days blurred into a numb haze. Marcus went through routines with mechanical precision, making coffee, going to work, nodding politely at colleagues, but inside, he was unraveling. His mind oscillated between disbelief and furious clarity. The moments when he had believed he knew everything about his wife now felt like elaborate illusions. He began noticing small signs he had overlooked: a lingering perfume on her scarf, her sudden defensive tone when he asked about her schedule, the way she sometimes seemed lost in thought, staring at nothing, as if listening to someone invisible. Then came the confrontation. Not the confrontation with Lydia, but the confrontation with himself. Marcus realized that he had spent years building a life on assumptions. The trust, while sacred, had been fragile. He felt a storm of emotions: grief, rage, heartbreak, humiliation, but also a perverse kind of clarity. He could no longer live in ignorance. He needed to face the truth, whatever it might be, and find a way to survive it. He began writing in a notebook, a private chronicle of what he felt and remembered. He wrote down every memory, every argument, every laugh and touch, and beside them, he wrote what he now suspected had been a lie. It was painful, methodical work, peeling away layers of their shared life to see the foundation, rotten in places, unshakable in others. Through it, he started noticing things about himself: resilience he hadn't acknowledged, a stubbornness to hold on to self respect, a willingness to feel, even if it hurt. Even it wasn't until a week later that Marcus finally confronted Lydia. She was sitting in the kitchen sipping tea as if nothing had changed. The letters were spread on the table between them like a gauntlet. Marcus looked at her, his hands shaking, and asked the first of many questions. Why? Lydia didn't flinch. She looked at him with a mixture of guilt and exhaustion. I I don't know where to start, she admitted. Her voice trembled, but there was no denying the truth. For hours they spoke. Or rather, she explained, and he listened. She told him about the affair, the loneliness she had felt, the thrill and guilt, the way she tried to reconcile it with the life they had built. Marcus felt like he was underwater, the words distant, muffled, yet searing. By the end of the night, nothing had been resolved. No apologies could erase the betrayal. No tears could rewind the clock. Marcus lay awake again, staring at the ceiling, but this time the paralysis was tinged with a different emotion. A faint, simmering awareness that he needed to reclaim himself from this wreckage. He didn't know how yet, but he knew he would have to. Perfect. Here's Part 2. Continuing this slow burning narrative. This part will focus on the confrontation, the raw emotional fallout, and the first steps Marcus takes toward reclaiming his sense of self. The kitchen smelled faintly of tea and cinnamon, ordinary, domestic, the scent of a home that no longer felt like his. Marcus sat across from Lydia. The letters sprawled between them like evidence in a trial, and for the first time, he studied her not as a partner, but as a stranger. The woman who had shared 15 years of his life, the woman whose laughter he thought was his sanctuary, now seemed foreign. He began with quiet questions. How long? 2 years, Lydia admitted. Her voice was barely audible. She avoided his eyes. I never meant for it to happen. I didn't know how to stop. Marcus's chest tightened. 2 years. That meant the life they had been living, the nights he thought they had shared, were interwoven with her lies. 2 years of duplicity, moments of intimacy, gestures of love, conversations about future plans, all shadowed by someone else. He had to stop himself from screaming, from throwing the letters across the room, from shaking her until she understood the depth of his devastation. He forced himself to breathe. The shock had dulled some of the pain, but now the raw reality began to seep in. Were you happy? His voice cracked, betraying the brittle calm he was trying to maintain. Lydia flinched. I don't know. Sometimes. With him, it felt exciting, like something was missing in us. But it wasn't about you. It's not your fault, Marcus. Her words were meant to soothe, but they only stung. Not her attempt at consolation, no. It was the implication that their life together had been insufficient, that he had not been enough. Marcus wanted to throw his hands up, to demand that she feel the weight of what she had done, but instead he felt hollow. The confrontation stretched for hours. Words stumbled, apologies fell flat, confessions spilled like shattered glass across the table. At one point, Marcus just sat back, exhausted, and realized that nothing she said could repair the fractures in his mind, could undo the trust that had been eroded daily for years. He could hear her, but he could not yet respond. He was no longer angry. He was adrift, a vessel without a rudder, suspended in a sea of disbelief and sorrow. When Lydia finally left the room, retreating to their bedroom in silence, Marcus remained at the kitchen table. The letters, once sharp and accusatory, now felt like mirrors reflecting the void inside him. He touched them lightly as if they were fragile relics, and in that quiet, he allowed himself to remember. He remembered the mornings she would make pancakes on Sunday, the nights they stayed up talking about nothing and everything, the vacations that smelled of sunscreen and salt water, but even those memories were tinged now with suspicion. Which ones had been hers alone? Which had been shared or performed or borrowed from some other life? Sleep eluded him again. When he finally did drift off, it was only in fragments, dreams interlaced with shadows, flashes of Lydia's face alongside a man he did not know. He woke drenched in sweat, his heart pounding as if it were trying to escape his chest. Over the next week, Marcus wandered through his own life like a ghost. He went to work, attended meetings, nodded politely when colleagues spoke to him, but inside he was a repository of questions with no answers. He began noticing details that once would have gone unnoticed: the ring Lydia wore, the way she hummed when she thought he wasn't listening, the faint smell of perfume that didn't belong to him. Every detail was now a potential clue, a reminder of the life he thought they shared versus the life she had kept hidden. And yet, amid the chaos, a strange clarity began to emerge. The letters, the betrayal, the endless questions. None of it had destroyed him completely. Marcus realized that while Lydia had violated the trust between them, he was still whole. The devastation had carved a hollow, but the hollow could be filled. Slowly, painfully, but it could be filled. He started small. He walked alone to the park, feeling the cold air bite at his cheeks. He stopped by the coffee shop where they had first met, ordered a black coffee, and watched strangers move through their lives without knowing his private calamity. The world continued, indifferent to his heartbreak, and that paradoxically was comforting. It reminded him that while Lydia's actions had hurt him, they did not define him. Marcus also began to write longer this time, not just in his notebook, but in emails to himself, letters he never sent, reflections that traced the contours of his pain. He catalogued every emotion, every memory, every confrontation. Writing became a form of exorcism, a way to disentangle himself from the grip of betrayal. Through words, he began to understand that his identity was not tethered to Lydia's choices. He was still Marcus, capable of love, capable of grief, capable of healing. Conversations with friends were tentative at first. He admitted to some, in careful fragments, that things were difficult, that he needed space. Some offered advice, others a shoulder. But the important part was the acknowledgement that he was not alone in his pain, that he could speak, could be heard, could begin to reclaim his own narrative. The first major breakthrough came unexpectedly. Marcus caught his reflection in a cafe window and saw the outline of a man he recognized. Not the same man who had discovered the letters, shaken and hollow, but someone hardened, cautious, yet strangely resilient. He allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. It was not joy. It was something smaller, something like hope, the knowledge that he could survive this, that he could learn to navigate a life reshaped by betrayal, was faint, but real. By the time Lydia attempted to engage him in conversation again, Marcus was no longer paralyzed. He listened to her calmly, without the immediate need to lash out or retreat. He could acknowledge her guilt without surrendering his own strength. He could hear her explanations, her apologies, and still maintain the boundaries that protected him. For the first time, he realized that confrontation was not a singular event. It was a process, an ongoing negotiation between grief, anger, and the slow reconstruction of self. The first morning Marcus woke without the crushing weight of letters on his mind, he felt something unfamiliar. Quiet, not peace, not yet, but a fragile silence that allowed thought to flow instead of collapse. He brewed coffee, black, and sipped it on the balcony, watching the city wake beneath him. The sky was pale and cold, but there was a sense of movement in the air, of life continuing regardless of betrayal, loss, or heartbreak. It had been months since the discovery, months of sleepless nights, long walks, and endless journaling. Lydia had moved out temporarily. Their marriage, if it could still be called that, was in suspended animation. Marcus wasn't naive. He knew the path ahead was uncertain, but he also understood something fundamental. Healing was not about her. Healing was about him. He began with routines, not for comfort, but for ownership of his life. He started exercising in the mornings, the physical effort, a tangible counterpoint to the mental and emotional labor he was enduring. He joined a book club, one he had always thought sounded interesting but never pursued, and found solace in conversation with strangers who had no stake in his heartbreak. Slowly, memories began to lose their poisonous edge. The laughter he had shared with Lydia, once a weapon in his mind, now became bittersweet instead of agonizing. He remembered their trips to the coast, the small towns with streets that smelled of salt and fried dough. He recalled her smile on quiet evenings, her stubborn insistence on burning candles even in the heat of summer. Pain remained, but the memories no longer inflicted raw wounds. They were brushstrokes in the larger canvas of his life. Marcus also allowed himself to grieve openly without shame or self consciousness. He cried on solitary walks in the privacy of his apartment, and sometimes even during late night phone calls with friends. Grief, he realized, was not a sign of weakness. It was a vital process, a reclamation of humanity after trauma. Each tear, each acknowledgement of hurt, was a step toward rebuilding the self that had been buried under lies. Lydia tried to speak to him again, tentatively, over the course of several weeks. He listened politely, sometimes asking questions, sometimes simply hearing her without judgment. He could forgive, perhaps, one day. But forgiveness was not synonymous with erasing the past. He understood now that trust, once broken, could only be reconstructed slowly, and only if both parties were willing, and he was not yet certain that she was. One evening, Marcus attended a friend's small gathering. Music hummed in the background, glasses clinked, and laughter threaded through the room like silver threads of light. Marcus stood by the window, watching the interplay of shadow and glow on the street below, and realized he could feel something unexpected. Desire. Not the longing for a replacement, not the yearning for Lydia's presence, but the desire to live fully, to engage with the world without the constant fear of betrayal. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but it marked a turning point. For the first time since discovering Lydia's double life, he allowed himself to imagine a future not defined by her choices, not dominated by pain, but authored by his own resilience and intentions. He could picture mornings that belonged entirely to him, conversations with people who had no connection to deceit, evenings of quiet reflection without shadows lurking in every corner. He began to explore aspects of himself that had been neglected during the marriage. Photography, something he had always enjoyed, became a daily practice. He hiked through nearby hills, carrying his camera, capturing the world through a lens that was neither judgmental nor tainted by betrayal. Even the simplest images, a spiderweb glistening with dew, the way light fractured across a puddle, reminded him that beauty existed outside pain. Marcus also re-examined the house, the physical space where betrayal had occurred. He rearranged furniture, painted walls, and filled rooms with objects that reflected him rather than both of them. Each act, though small, was symbolic, reclaiming territory, asserting identity, choosing himself. The most profound change, however, was internal. He no longer defined his worth by her validation. He had once believed that the measure of his life was shared happiness, that his identity was inseparable from the woman he loved. Now he understood that his life was his own, and that love, healthy, reciprocal love, was an addition, not the foundation. Months passed. He encountered reminders of the past, the letters tucked away in a drawer, Lydia's occasional messages, but they no longer held the power to shatter him. Marcus had grown resilient, tempered by grief, but not embittered, aware of vulnerability, yet steadfast in self-respect. The slow, burning fire of betrayal had consumed much, but it had also purified the parts of him that had relied too heavily on another for meaning. One afternoon, as sunlight pooled across his living room, Marcus found himself smiling at a memory, not one poisoned by deceit, but one of genuine warmth. He realized he had reached a point where the past no longer dictated his present. He could love, he could trust, he could live, and if he chose to open his heart again, it would be on his terms. He didn't need closure from Lydia. He didn't need her confessions or apologies to validate his survival. He had survived on his own, and that was enough. The world remained unpredictable. Human hearts remained fallible. But Marcus had discovered something enduring, his own strength, his own worth, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that life, even after devastation, could be beautiful once more. He lifted his camera and looked out the window, focusing on the ordinary streets, the scattered pedestrians, the sunlight on leaves. He clicked. The shutter sound was soft, definitive. In that moment, Marcus understood that he was not merely surviving, he was living fully, intentionally, and unafraid. And